Hello everyone. I will be presenting the paper Impact of Self-Contacts on Perceived Pose Equivalences by Jean Basset, Badr Ouannas, Ludovic Hoyet, Franck Multon and Stefanie Wuhrer. With the increasing demand for 3D content for applications such as animation movies, virtual reality or video games, a lot of interest has been recently given to digital humans and more specifically on creating new realistic animations for digital humans. A common approach for this is the deformation transfer approach that aims to generate new animation from existing data. Deformation transfer takes as input a source character performing a specific pose, as can be seen on the left here, and a target character, and aims to generate the target character performing a pose that is as similar as possible to the pose of the source character. In order to perform deformation transfer, we must first define what makes two poses equivalent in order to mimic as best as possible the pose of the source character. However, this is not obvious as poses tend to change depending on, for example, context or on the morphology of the characters performing it. This can be seen, for example, on this slide with these four characters that are extracted from the first dataset. Inside this dataset, these four characters are considered to have the same pose, and us as human observers can agree that this is a pretty similar pose. This is a yoga pose with a raised leg and raised arms. However, there are some small differences between the poses, such as the angle of the arms or the point of contact between the foot and the leg. But we argue that these differences do not change the meaning of the pose. This means that to define what makes two poses equivalent, we must understand which constraints are important to the meaning of the pose, and which could be changed, and which changes do not change the meaning of the pose. Existing works have explored how to preserve the meaning of the pose in deformation transfer methods. A common strategy is to encode distance constraints between either the joints of the skeleton of the characters or between points on the surface of the body of the characters. Deformation transfer is then performed by preserving these distance constraints between the selected points in order to preserve the general topology of the pose in the resulting character. While this strategy works well for the most cases, preserving exactly distance constraint between points on the surface of the body can generate artifacts when working with difficult poses or extreme morphologies. For example, on this slide you can see two characters performing a very similar pose, but with very different morphologies. On this pose, there are distance constraints, and more specifically self-contacts, that are important to the meaning of the pose. This is, for example, the contact between the hands of the characters. If this contact was removed, we would consider that the pose has changed its meaning. However, there are also self-contacts that do not have this importance. For example, on the view from the top, you can see that there is a contact that appears between the torso and the arms of the larger character that is not present on the thinner character. We argue that this contact does not change the meaning of the pose and only appeared in order to adapt to the larger morphology of the right character. In this paper, we are interested in exploring which distance constraints are important to the meaning of the pose and which should be allowed to change in order to allow to adapt to the context or to the morphology of the new character. For this first exploration, we choose to focus specifically on self-contacts. A lot of previous works have explored how human observers perceive animations or poses of human characters. They have shown that human observers are able to perceive and evaluate if two characters are performing a pose that is similar. In this paper, we thus chose to create a perceptive study in order to leverage the perception of human observers in order to rate which self-contacts are important to the meaning of the pose and which are not. Some previous works have explored which characteristics of the poses are important to their meanings. For example, the two studies on this slide showed that observers then gave more importance to the wrists, the hands, and the head of the characters when mimicking a pose or evaluating how similar the pose was to another one. In this paper, we designed a perceptive study to explore the relative importance of self-contacts on the pose equivalence perceived by observers. We first aim to validate the common assumption that self-contacts are in general important to the meaning of the pose. This is a common assumption in deformation transfer works that aim to preserve exactly distance constraints between the source character and the generated character. Based on our observations and on the previous studies, we also make the hypothesis that self-contacts involving the ends are more important to the meaning of the pose than others. And with this hypothesis, we aim to give a first exploration of how to select which constraints are important to the meaning of the pose and which are not. In our study, we presented observers with human characters in poses presenting different self-contacts. We selected these poses from datasets of human poses such as the Faust dataset presented earlier or other datasets. We selected poses of characters with self-contacts involving the hands or the arms of the characters and the upper body above the thighs and below the neck. We chose to limit ourselves to these contacts in order to limit the size of our study and to be able to perform our study in a reasonable amount of time. And we chose these specific self-contacts since they are very common in everyday human poses. In order to have different characters performing similar poses to evaluate in our study, we needed to have different target identities on which to apply our selected poses. To do so, we chose to use the SMPL body model. SMPL is a statistical human body model that represents the main variations of the human bodies and poses, and is based on a large dataset of real scans of human bodies. The SMPL model can be separated in shape and pose parameters, and the main shape parameters represent the main variations of the human body. For the target identities used in our study, we chose to use the first two shapes parameters of the SMPL model and to take models at plus or minus 2 standard deviations on these shape parameters. This gives us the 4 identities that you can see on this slide here. We chose to limit ourselves to the male model of the SMPL parameters, once again in order to limit the size of our study and to be able to perform our study in a reasonable amount of time. Once we had our selected poses and identities, we performed deformation transfer in order to generate the characters to be presented in our study. For each source pose and target identity, we generated several pose variations of a character with the target identity performing a pose that is similar to the source pose. The first pose variation we created is the second from the left here, is the original contact pose, which is the target character performing a pose that is similar to the source with the exact same self-contacts, such as the ones of the hands on this example here. We also created another pose variation for each self-contact present in the source pose, where we selectively removed this self-contact from the results. This is the two characters on the right here, and you can see that in this example, the contacts between the hands and the body were selectively removed in each of the pose variations. When generating pose variations by releasing a contact, a distance is created between the body parts that were previously in contact. We call this distance the contact release distance. We did not exactly control this distance when generating our pose variations, but we are still interested in its impact on our results. We computed the contact release distance for each of our pose variations in which we released a contact, and we report these contact release distances on this figure you can see on this slide. On the x-axis are intervals of distance for these contact release distances, and on the y-axis is the number of pose variations with a release self-contacts that created a distance among each interval of release distance. The blue count corresponds to the self-contacts that involved the hands of the characters, and the red count corresponds to the self-contacts that involved the arms of the characters. While we did not exactly control the contact release distances in our pose variations, you can see in this figure that these distances are still relatively well distributed between our categories, arms and hands contacts. Finally, we used the generated pose variations in order to create our perceptive study. We presented the observers with this screen. On the left, we presented a reference shape that corresponds to a target identity, and a reference pose that corresponds to a source pose from our dataset. We then presented on the right two deformation transfer results for this target identity and this source pose with two different pose variations. One of those was the original contact pose, so it had the same self-contact as the reference pose, and the other was a pose variation with one of the contacts of the reference pose that was released. We presented these two pose variations in a random order, left or right. We then asked the participants to select which pose best imitates the reference pose, and we asked them to give a confidence score in their answer before moving to the next question. We shared our study online using different academic mailing lists. After removing participants that did not answer to the full study, we obtained 81 participants. We gathered a few demographic data such as the ages, the gender, the prior experience with 3D animations, and the size of the screen used to perform the study. In our dataset, we had a total of 120 examples of a target identity, plus a source pose, plus a pose variation, so 120 questions to ask to the participants. Each participant was presented with 30 of these examples, and each example was seen by at least 17 participants and in average 20. I will now present the results of our perceptive study. Our first hypothesis was the common assumption that self-contacts are in general important to the meaning of the pose. In our study, we observed that the pose variation with a removed self-contact was chosen in only 27% of answers. As a reminder, if participants could not decide which pose variation best mimicked the reference pose, the selection rate would be around a 50% chance level. We showed that the 27% selection rate for the pose variation with a removed self-contact is significantly lower than a 50% chance level using a one-sample t-test. We also observed that the reported confidence when choosing the pose with different self-contact is of 2.93 in our study, whereas the reported confidence when choosing the pose with the same self-contact as the reference pose is of 3.6. We once again showed that this difference is significant using a chi-squared independence test. These observations tend to show that observers find the pose with the same self-contact as the reference pose to be more similar to the reference pose in most cases, and are more confident in their answers when choosing this pose with similar self-contacts. These observations tend to validate the hypothesis that self-contacts are in general important to the meaning of the pose. Our second hypothesis is that self-contacts involving the ends of the characters are more important to the meaning of the pose than others. In our study, we separated our pose variations in two categories: the self-contacts involving the ends of the characters and the self-contacts involving the arms of the characters. For the end category, we observed that the pose variation with different self-contacts was chosen in 18% of answers, and that the reported confidence for questions involving self-contacts with the ends of the characters was of 3.66. For the arm category, the pose variation with different self-contacts than the reference pose was chosen in 34% of answers, and the reported confidence for questions with a self-contact involving the arms of the characters was of 3.24. We showed that these differences are significant using Kruskal-Wallis one-way analysis of variance tests. This shows that observers selected significantly less often the pose variation with different self-contacts for the end category than for the arm category, and were significantly more confident in their answers. This suggests that participants gave more importance to the ends of the characters when choosing which pose best mimics a reference pose, and more specifically gave more importance to preserving self-contacts involving the ends of the characters than other self-contacts. These observations tend to validate our hypothesis that self-contacts involving the ends of the characters are more important to the meaning of the pose than others. In this figure, we study the impact of the contact release distance on our results. On the x-axis are the intervals of contact release distance, and on the y-axis is the selection rate for pose variation with a removed self-contacts with a contact release distance belonging to each interval. We observe that participants chose significantly less often the pose variation with a removed self-contact when the contact release distance was above 10 cm than the 4 to 6 interval and the 0 to 2 cm interval. This is a first exploration of the impact of the contact release distance, and further study should be performed in order to better understand and to determine a threshold above which the self-contact is considered to be released and significantly changes the meaning of the pose. In conclusion, in this study we explored the importance of distance constraints on the meaning of the pose, and more specifically self-contacts. We showed that self-contacts are in general an important characteristic of the pose, and that removing them can change the meaning of the pose in most cases. We also showed that self-contacts had a different importance on the meaning of the pose depending on the body parts involved, and more specifically that self-contacts involving the hands of the characters are more important to the meaning of the pose than self-contacts involving the arms. A first strategy for deformation transfer approaches would thus be to prioritize preserving the self-contacts involving the hands of the characters while allowing other self-contacts to appear or disappear in order to adapt to the morphology of the target character. This study is a first exploration, and future work must be done in order to better understand the impact of self-contacts on perceived pose equivalences. This future study should focus on the impact of several parameters, such as self-contacts involving other body parts than the hands and the arms of the characters. This future study should also explore more in depth the impact of the morphology of the characters on the meaning of the pose, by using more various body shapes, and more specifically female and gender-neutral body shapes, and using more shape parameters of the human body model. These further studies should also further explore the impact of the contact release distance in order to determine a threshold above which self-contacts are perceived to change the meaning of the pose when released. Finally, these future studies should take into account the context of the poses of the characters, as the context may change which constraints are important to the meaning of the pose and which are not. Thank you for your attention.